So I think it's important to actually have a lens of the people that are doing the work and also doing the presenting. And so to offer that identify as assigned sex female, currently gender identity is woman, and identify as queer along a sexual identity spectrum. Also the background and the journey we take influence what we do as well, and so it's important to identify that I started out as a physiologist, so my background was science, which is different than a lot of journeys in social behavioral sciences. I was hired as a women's softball coach back in a long time ago, and was fired from that position because I was gay in 1996 from Penn State. Stayed at the institution, and it's not, that's not, oh, I'm not a victim, it's good. And moved from, so my background in athletics actually has a lot to do with the work that I do. So the coaching and the team piece will come out as I do this presentation as my guest, so I'll start coaching in a little bit. I then moved into the administration. I worked there in the provost office for 12 years and then moved back to the College of Education where I had the pleasure of working as a faculty member. So I think that journey gives you, my own background gives you a lens of what we do. And the pleasure of working and collaborating with Genny has been a wonderful experience because I am not transgender. And I don't like to be the voice of a population, and I think that we need to have more transgender folks doing the research and being involved and being hired in faculties to bring that experience that all I can do is bring their voices. So I'm privileged to be able to do that. So the first study was Genny's and I. Just took us a long time to publish because it's important to also know that LGBTQAI whatever research is not funded very well. And so we had no funding for this research project in this book. This was done totally on our backs, which was a pleasure. So I'm not offering, again, not for sympathy, but that we need to find more ways to have organizations and foundations start funding the work so we could have more information. So the second study was the NCTE NGLTF study, which I also was a part of. So I helped develop the survey and hosted it and did some work with both Mark Hiesling and the folks at NGLTF to do this. So what we found in the NCT study, it's a discrimination study. We're looking at how transgender folks are experiencing discrimination in housing and employment, et cetera. And the beauty of this study was that we did it, you learn as a survey researcher, right? That's what I do with my life, from what we've done before. And we knew that we needed to do a better job of reaching people who didn't have online access, right? So we did, in this study, canvassing of neighborhoods where we knew there were trans folks, went to conferences, homeless shelters, offered it in Spanish and English. And so I think being able to reach a broader community and not having it be a white transgender experience, which is what we tend to do in some of the work that we do as in our own lenses of white researchers. So you can see that a lot of what Genny and I found also were found here, in that 60% were assigned male at birth who responded. And that's a phenomenon to study because most of the students that we work with are actually openly trans men in some trans-masculine spectrum, somewhere along the spectrum. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of the important findings were around education and employment, that for the most part only half of the population that was surveyed had an education. Right? And that's, I think, a finding that was interesting. We also found they were mostly underemployed or unemployed. So again, we have a lot more work to do. We're actually working now to redo this project again with some funding, hopefully, with NCTE. So hopefully that'll be a redo. And not me. Somebody else needs to do this work, too. So I'm getting old. I want to retire. So my folks in the audience who are my students or former students, it's on your backs now to do this, right? So 41% attempted suicide. This is difficult, given the story that Jeff told and the many stories that are untold, because they weren't able to be part of society, they're not here. And so there are still folks who are living in places like Kansas. And there was one young person in our study who says, it's the first time I'm saying to anybody out loud that I'm transgender, still. So I think even though we have the experiences and the internet and all of these things, there are still folks that need, our support, especially when they come to an institution like this and expect services and support. Trans folks of color experience harassment, discrimination, and harassment in every area that we looked at. So multiple identities is important to see and not just focus on one, that we have multiple identities and how those together may influence how we experience our life. And if you go to the NCTE website, I'm not going to go through all of the results of this, but you can go to the NCTE website, and there are now several articles that have come out of this data set that examine, from a critical race perspective, individual categories of race, how Asian American, Southeast Asian American, or Southeast Asian folks who are trans experience this discrimination, how the Native American, how African American. So I think looking at those identities as individual entities and not comparing them to white, which we always do, to see in fact how those experiences are different or the same across those different races. Other key findings were that those who expressed transgender identity were, while in grades K through 12, had much greater alarming, we use the word alarming here on purpose, rates of these kinds of experiences: harassment, physical assault, sexual violence. You know what the GLSEN studies? Are you familiar with the GLSEN K through 12 studies? I do higher education climate studies, but GLSEN does K through 12. Read some of those statistics, and these actually map to the things we're seeing here. So there are patterns across the research, which then mean that it's not just one group saying this or one group of researchers or another. It's actually being shown in multiple studies. They're trying to show here this is what's happening. Among college students, 35% reported harassment, 5% physical assault, 3% sexual assault, and 2 being expelled. And these are all due to their gender identity and expression. So some of these things, I'm looking at the people going, I can see some of the eyes going, oh my goodness, like, right? So this is information that's out there, so I'm glad we're here sharing it, but as people who work in higher education, we should know some of this stuff, right? Other key findings. Mistreatment in school is correlated with lower income levels, higher rates of drug use and abuse, and alcohol use and abuse, a greater likelihood of homelessness, incarceration, being HIV positive, reporting sex work, and increased suicide attempts. GNL, which is gender not listed, we had, so the interesting thing in survey research is that I think about gender and sexuality as fluid, obviously, that's what I talk about. But I work in survey research and set people in boxes, right? So it's kind of an oxymoron. But we try to expand the boxes as much as we can so that we're being inclusive. And in doing our study, Genny and I had categories that were outside of the gender binary that we created. And that took me a year to do because of the amazing amount of identities that folks offered about who they were. And we wanted to value those voices and not put them in a box, but unfortunately in survey research you need boxes to do analysis. So I'm apologizing for that, I think. So GNL we used here in this study to identify individuals who were not in any of those other categories of trans, and found that they had higher rates of harassment and assault in K through 12 than anybody else. The highest rate being among female-assigned GNL individuals. And to hear the stories of folks, this was a quantitative study only. We did not do interviews here, but if I parallel the stories that we heard in our interviews, it's difficult to listen to and to hear the pain. And Genny offered that at the end of our survey, we asked, if you want to be interviewed and talk more about this, please contact us. That's when we had to say, they all wanted to talk, all 3,500 of them. So I'm like, well, no, we can't do that. Okay, so the next one that I want to talk about, and these are all available online. I mean, the hope was that you could download these and look at them in more detail if you're interested. And if you didn't get that first slide where we had the URL offered, if you just go to Stonewall at UMass Boston, you'll be able to get to that site. Oh yeah, sorry. UMass Amherst. Okay. I had Boston on my head because it's one of my clients right now. So the other work I do is around LGBT campus climate. And I've done a number of national studies looking at the national environment for LGBTQAI folks. So the most recent one is the State of Higher Education Report 2010. And I wanted to give you a comparison here and ask you as an audience, what strikes you about the difference? I did one in 2003. It was an NGLTF study that NASPA also gave me a little bit of money, $500 to do a study, national study. In 2010, I did another study, and this one was actually supported in part by Campus Pride. Their support was that they published the report, and the support to do the study came from my own institution. So I do want to credit Penn State for allowing me to do the work and giving me the support to do so. So you can see that. Let me ask this. What strikes you between the two different slides from 03 to 10, just on the samples? Numbers are huge. Why do you think? This is where I ask the questions and you all answer. So, yeah, in 2003, unfortunately, or now I'm dating myself, I didn't have online surveys. We only had paper and pencil, no SurveyMonkey back then. So the big difference there is because of the internet and the ability to actually reach a larger population, and the consortium of LGBTQ educators, which is a group that I helped found, was instrumental in reaching students on college campuses that we couldn't reach before. So we now have a greater network, right? So thank you to the Clementi Center and the work that the LGBT Center here is doing. So anyway, what else strikes you? I'm seeing people go, bah, 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 bah. Go ahead and offer, it's okay. Much greater trans spectrum. Now notice that I used transgender in 2003, and I used trans spectrum in 2010. And there's the terminology that I'm trying to use now to identify fluidity is queer spectrum and trans spectrum, because it's too difficult to identify them within boxes. And frankly, LGBTQ are white social constructs and not used as much by other communities outside of the white community. So I wanted to make sure we're being inclusive. The other is that I only had 69 respondents in 03 who were trans. And thanks to my colleague Genny, that's why we actually did the Lives of Transgender People book, because Genny came to me and said, you missed the boat on the trans people. I'm like, oh, all right, enlighten me. So that's where this whole project started. Anything else strike you? We had all 50 states. Somebody from every state participated in the project, an institution from every state. And the other one to point out is that the number of institutions were across the Carnegie classifications. We had community colleges, comprehensive, state institutions, liberal arts, et cetera. We did not have any HBCUs or any HSIs. So another area rich for research. So what we found in 2010 around gender was that we had many identifying across the trans-masculine, trans-feminine spectrum. And gender nonconforming we offered as, many folks use gender nonconforming as the overall umbrella for trans. And we separated them out because people identifying as along a masculine identifiable spectrum were trans-masculine. Those across trans-feminine were trans-feminine, but gender androgynous, gender queer, all of those really didn't fit in any kind of a binary of expression. And so, again, the difficulty in survey research is trying to find ways to categorize folks, to value the voice of those people, but then also to be able to do the analyses. So you can see that also here we had many of our folks still identifying within the gender binary, but many more identifying across those spectrums. The key findings were that in the trans-masculine, in the transgender population, that 31 to 39% of trans-masculine, trans-feminine, and GNC folks had experienced harassment on campus. And that harassment came in the forms of both subtle and overt kinds of things that were occurring. So it wasn't like everyone's getting beat up. But there are many stories of the subtle kinds of things that occur. And those subtle things, microaggressions, if you will, build up. And after a while, the person's going to blow in some way, right? I'm going to take it for so long, like I hear this, or I see this, or I'm isolated, or I'm left out, and these things occur and occur and occur, and after a while, we've got students doing things that are usually harmful, right? Either drug use and abuse, alcohol use and abuse, et cetera. So those are the kind of things they talk to us about. 22% between 17 and 22% respondents had experienced harassment and feared for their physical safety on campus. So it means that I'm afraid to be on campus, be who I am, for my own safety. Other findings around students were that they avoided disclosure based upon their identity. I'm not going to tell you who I am. That was much easier for trans-masculine than for trans-feminine, as Jenny's already pointed out. Fear physical safety, trans-spectrum 43%, and concealed their identity 63%. So we've got a lot of work still to do. This is 2010. I mean, it's not like it's like 20 years ago. So we still have a lot of work to do around some of the trans folks on our campuses. Other findings, more than half of trans-spectrum respondents felt comfortable with their institutional climate. Here's the oxymoron. However, 1/3 thought they're going to leave, felt like leaving. Now, obviously they didn't leave because they filled the survey out, so they're still there. So how many students had already left because how bad the climate was for them, right? And the comfort with the institution, I think, are for those, in most of my climate work, I've done now over 120 institutional climate assessments across the country at institutions of higher education. And this happens most often, that overall, I'm pretty okay with the campus climate. It's in my work unit and my department and my classes where I'm having the issues, right? So it's how you ask the questions is important.